So you wrote in your recent column, it's from August 8th, misunderstandings, bias, hobble efforts to legalize political gambling in the US. And one of the things you wrote, which we of course agree with, you wrote, I'm quoting here, betting lines, in fact, might be just the panacea to detect and prevent such interference and conspiracy. Given that many people have vested interest in ferreting out problems, could be the solution, not the cause of malfeasance. So, I mean, basically, what you were writing about is the fact that if political prediction markets live up to their potential, when you see in our discourse people like Trump supporters, for example, believing things that are not true, um, this venue, political gambling, is one area where you can go in and uh, force people to pay a price when they're wrong
Right.
and incentivize people who do have an accurate sense of reality to come in and correct the markets, take advantage of that. Why do you think more people broadly in the policymaking community, and I would include in that journalists, but journalists, regulators, politicians, why don't more people see that potential the way you do?
Um, there is a significant prejudice against gamblers in general, bookies, as they're often referred to, as if it's like some shady guy in a hat in a smoke-filled room. I've been covering Vegas for a long time. I first moved to Las Vegas as a reporter in 1996. It was sort of prehistoric times in some ways. It was before it was before a lot of the major construction and the building up of the strip, but also the sort of mainstreaming of gambling in this country. And so I have a long history of having sort of the same conversation with a lot of journalists who either don't live in Vegas, have never lived in Vegas, aren't interested in gambling, or or have a bias against it, which is there's a distaste in general for um, the idea that people will spend their money on chance, on games. And the conversation I have over and over again, where people will be like, "Isn't it horrible that they go and they spend all this money at the slot machines or at the tables?" And my response is always, nobody ever says that when somebody spends $200 or $300 to take their family to a baseball game. That's a form of entertainment. They're never going to see that money again. The experience will last a couple of hours. They'll pay absurd amounts of money for the food that they're eating and the parking and all the rest of it, but they choose to do that, and nobody says, "Oh my God, they're degenerate," because that's how they choose to do it, or go to the movies, or go to a show, or any number of ways that Americans or people in general enjoy entertainment. And so the idea that people enjoy taking risks and getting a reward or not getting a reward, but they're okay with that because it's all sort of part of the entertainment that they have asked to enjoy. um it escapes a lot of folks. There's just a sleazy um patina around gambling in general. And so when you fuse it with something like politics and something as important as who our leaders are going to be, um, you get sort of a toxic mix that just blinds a lot of people who, if you really were able to explain to them why there's no difference, why, for example, why it is somewhat absurd that a gambler, a single person, or even a few gamblers could actually affect the outcome of an election that involves millions of people and so many moving parts. um it 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 defies logic, but it's so much easier, it's so much simpler to say that gamblers or these sleazy people are gonna buy elections or manipulate the outcomes. I mean, even a campaign manager can't really manipulate the outcome of an election. I mean, they the risks of doing so are so high. The difficulty of of creating a conspiracy that complex and then keeping it a secret is so improbable. It actually it connects quite a bit to another pet peeve I have that I write about a lot, which is that I don't understand why NFL players are not allowed to bet on NFL games. I'm fine, I guess, with the appearance of impropriety problem with them betting on their own games, but I don't know what a guy on the Jets can possibly do to impact the outcome of the Miami Bills game. I don't see it would take a massive conspiracy, and the more people you bring into a conspiracy, either to rig an election or rig a football game, when everybody's watching it, it is it's unfathomable. It's not practical, and those should be the bases on which we decide our laws. And so I think that if people were able to more widely bet on politics for as we're talking about certain types of races. I mean, maybe like small local races probably are a little too sensitive, because in some cases you're talking about a few hundred or maybe a few thousand people voting, and so maybe there's a bit more control that can be rigged into the outcome of some of those races. But a national race, a statewide race, I just don't see how any gamblers could really get together and screw with it. I just don't see how it's possible.
Yeah, it's very interesting. This review that the CFTC and the broader US government, I suppose, are conducting on political gambling regulation has been quite illuminating, because I mean, look, I have a bias, I'm a partisan in this, but if I were to look at it as a lawyer, look at it objectively, and think about the pros and cons of opening the doors to political betting, I mean, I could probably think of 10 to 15 arguments against doing this that would be far more persuasive and compelling than anything whatsoever having to do with election manipulation, threats to democracy, that whole basket of things. And yet, when you look at the comments period that have come at the CFTC, when you've looked at members of Congress, when they've chosen to weigh in,
Right.
overwhelmingly, the thing that they are really harping on, the thing that really seems to give them qualms about this, is this potential of political betting, political gambling to really muddle with our democracy and politics. Now, you make the argument in your column. It's I would urge our audience to check it out. It's quite a hard-hitting piece, but you essentially say that, in fact, I'll just read your words. I mean, you describe Ralston Benham, the chairman of the CFTC, as, quote, someone who knows so little about gambling and elections. I guess, I mean, I want to ask you, do you think, this is not a leading question, this is actually something I am thinking through a lot as well. When regulators and politicians raise this concern about the threat of political gambling to elections, is it the case that this is a sincere fear of theirs, but they just happen not to be really knowledgeable about the realities of the space? Or is it more of what you were saying earlier, that they just kind of have an uneasy, queasy stigma sort of thing about gambling? They just find it distasteful. Something about the combination of gambling and politics irks their moral sensibility. And once they have that bad intuition, they then try to apply their logical mind to look for some rationale that can legitimate their moral distaste. Like what's going on here?
I think it's both. I really
Yeah.
do. I mean, I think that it depends on who we're talking about. I don't doubt that people are afraid of the vulnerabilities of the election system. I just don't think they thought very rationally about what they're afraid of. And part of that is an important sort of element, which is, in order for American democracy, American elections to work, the public has to feel confident in it. They have to believe in it. They have to trust that the outcomes are accurate and fair. And so right now in particular, when we have a concerted effort over several years to undermine the sense of whether the votes are counted right, the machines are operating properly, the media is being an honest broker, or any of these other things, I can see why throwing yet another controversial thing into that formula could be just something more than politicians are interested in going near. It's already such a mess in terms of the public discourse about how our elections work. So even though they are the safest elections, the most secure elections, and they only get more safe and secure, and not less. But some forces in our country have done a very good job of terrifying people about whether our elections are accurately reflecting, or the outcomes are accurately reflecting the way that people have actually cast their votes. And so I understand the hesitancy, and then you add into it the fact that the dude who happens to be at the center of it, he at the moment he's neither a politician nor a gambler. He's just a financial regulator. I don't remember what his background is, but he's on that board because he wants to make sure that wheat is traded properly. He's not really there to decide whether Americans are allowed to buy these types of options and markets. And so, but at the same time, his answer should be better, like you said. There are probably better. I may have just made a better argument for staying away from this than he did when he went on this Bloomberg show, and you guys played that audio last week or the week before recently, and that's where I picked it up, and he basically said that he, as the financial regulator, doesn't want to have to make a decision about whether an options contract is valid or not based on the questions about whether the elections were free and fair. And the answer to that is, well, he never would, because the markets, the bookies would write into the contract exactly what would happen if there were challenges to the election. And in fact, we know that works because it happened in 2020. There were all those contracts on the 2020 election and all that controversy and all of those lawsuits. And the CFTC was not asked to adjudicate whether those contracts and those markets were settled properly. It didn't happen.
Well, not only 2020, I made the point in my comment to the CFTC, in many ways more so than 2020, 2000. At that time, Predicted was not around, but Intrade was around. The Iowa electronic markets were around. There were very serious allegations about voter integrity, election fraud. I think unlike the 2020 election, where it is abundantly clear who in fact won, I think to this day we don't really know. I don't think we can know that election was settled by 538 votes. There was no call for, of all things, this is a case that went to the Supreme Court. There was no shortage of people seeking legal remedies. The CFTC was not one of the bodies that was called into this. It was an utterly bizarre comment by Chairman Benham, and it's particularly bizarre because, in a sense, I understand where he's coming from, that he's a lawyer by training, and I think, like, if I were a commissioner on the CFTC, I would have actually pretty serious qualms about overstepping authority from Congress. I'm not sure that the CFTC really does have the go-ahead from Congress, that Congress has clearly given the CFTC the authority to give the go-ahead here. That's a very different argument from saying that if we give the go-ahead to election markets, the CFTC could be caught up in regulating and policing elections, being an election cop. So it's bizarre. But I mean, I guess I'm inclined to agree with the conclusion you reached here, that probably it's a case of ignorance more than anything else.